And welcome to our program for this evening. I'm Linda Lyons. I'm a member of the board of Save Our Seminary. It's a great pleasure to have you all here tonight. And I've been asked to introduce our speakers. Gene Rich is a senior fellow and director of Mathematica's Center on Healthcare Effectiveness. He's an expert on the sources of practice variation in medical care, which I think must interest us all these days. As a practicing general internist, he also has an abiding interest in improving the delivery of primary care and the policies needed to accomplish this. He's also a volunteer clinical instructor in internal medicine resident practice at the Walter Reed National Military Center in Bethesda. Don Hall is a retired Army colonel who serves as the Chief of Staff for the Defense Centers of Excellence for Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury. He has served nearly 30 years in the United States Army, culminating as Assistant Chief of Staff for operations of the Northern Regional Medical Command of Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. Don has earned several degrees. He has a doctorate of philosophy in nuclear engineering, a Master of Science in Nuclear Engineering, a Master of Arts in American History, and he is an alumnus, I'm sure he would want me to say, of the University of Michigan. And finally, we'll conclude the program with a few remarks from Andrea Skierkoff, the public program manager for the National Museum of Health and Medicine, which has become our new neighbor out here, and we'll be very happy to know more about their programs. So I think Gene Rich is going to lead off.
Thank you very much. And welcome to another of our series of Veterans Day programs here on the campus of the Walter Reed Forest Glen Annex, which we're going to hear a little bit about. And let's see if I can successfully activate this. All right, that's promising. So we're going to talk about the history of the medical services at the Walter Reed Annex. Now, I'll have to warn you that while our objectives are to review how medical technologies and treatments have evolved during the Army years and the role of Forest Glen in these advances, we're just going to touch on the surface of this. We're just going to talk about 1945 this time. So we're imagining that there's a lot more to say in future Veterans Days events here. And we're also, as you heard, very pleased to have Andrea Skierkoff here because the folks at the museum have been very helpful to us in all of this. And Don wanted me to put up that the views expressed are our own and do not reflect those of the Department of Defense, Mathematica Policy Research, or Save Our Seminary. And Don's going to talk about how we turned into a medical campus.
All right. Do we have any alumni of the University of Maryland out there? No. Tomorrow, the President of the United States is awarding a member of the class of 2006 the Medal of Honor. Just figured I'd point that out. Anyway, to put Forest Glen in World War II in perspective, we kind of have to look at what's going on in the world. Of course, the United States, very small army, and in 1940, they started the peacetime draft and started to bring people in for a year, which turned into 6, because the draft said 1 year or the duration plus 6 months. And so everyone who got called up in late 1940 was there when we declared war on the Japanese, and they stayed for the duration. But we had a Europe first policy, so they decided that they'd start sending troops over in 1942 to Europe, and by Europe I mean, of course, Great Britain. And as the Army continued to expand, and their goal was to have over 100 divisions, They never could do that because they needed too many replacements and they needed more air crews for the bombers. They started to look at how they could meet their requirements for hospitalization. And so they started in 1942 looking at a process of taking over civilian facilities, primarily existing hospitals, hotels, schools, to be converted into Army hospitals. And the reason was we were starting to get lots of casualties in. Bataan fell in April of 42. Of course, that didn't generate a lot of casualties. That generated a lot of prisoners of war. Casablanca, which was our first combat operations in Europe, 8 November 1942, and then after that we took on Rommel. Guadalcanal was November of 42 also. And the plan was, in 1942, they were planning the D-Day invasion to take place in 1943. And so their plan was, how do we have enough beds to handle all those casualties? Because we can't build enough hospitals fast enough to do that. And that's where the program of converting hotels, converting existing hospitals, converting schools all came into play. And they surveyed over 100 facilities. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. They surveyed over 100 facilities. They ended up taking over 25, one of which was the National Park Seminary, which, for those of you who don't know, is about 3 miles from the main campus. And in 1942, this was actually a fairly remote place. They had to bus the staff in because there were no trolleys that ran here. There were no bus lines that ran here. So they had to bring the staff in from main campus. They actually housed some of the civilian staff here. But anyway, they were looking at the hotels that were right around the main campus and the apartment buildings to take over for staff housing as they expanded. But there was a lot of pushback from the people in the Tacoma Park area, Tacoma Park, D.C., because as Washington grew bigger with the expansion of the federal government during the war, they needed housing for government workers. They said, don't take over a hotel. We need it. Don't take over an apartment building. We need it to put these people in. And so they turned their attention to the National Park Seminary. There's some speculation as to whether that may have been an invited attention. We'll be researching that in the future. But in the legend goes, in August 1942, General Street, who's the commander of Walter Reed, Major General, 2 stars, same rank as the Surgeon General. In fact, they said Walter Reed was the best job to have in the Army Medical Department because you got 2 stars and nobody could boss you around because you're the same rank as the Surgeon General. Came out to meet with the president of the National Park Seminary, said, we're taking the place over. And, oh, by the way, you got 2 weeks to get out. So that took place in August of 42. Condemnation proceedings took 2 weeks. We have a copy of the testimony. Now, there are 3 reasons that you would condemn a property in the federal government. One is that you cannot agree on a price. One is that the owner does not want to give up the property. And the third one is if there is a deed restriction on the property that needs to be broken. And then you would formally condemn the property, otherwise the deed restriction would transfer. And at least a portion of the National Park Seminary's deeded the land only for use as a girls' school or in support of a girls' school. And so they needed to break that. So it appears that it was an amicable condemnation. As I said, it went through in 2 weeks. They spent $890,000 to purchase the property. That included some of the furniture. That included some of the supplies, kitchenware, things like that was part of that deal. And then they turned around and started the renovation and conversion. We have a copy of that report. It appears that it was a cost-plus contract, which they used in World War II, which was you just show us the bills of what you bought and what you paid for labor, and we'll pay that plus a certain percentage profit, and in the meantime, you do whatever we tell you to do. And they spent about 90 days to convert from a girls' school to the hospital. The plan was that everyone would come to Walter Reed, to the main campus, and there they would sort you into one of three categories. If you were so severely injured that you were going to need institutional care or an extremely long rehabilitation, you were paralyzed, you'd lost all four limbs, what have you, you would go from Walter Reed into the Veterans Administration system. If you were going to get patched up and you were going to go back into the fight, and somehow you'd gotten back to the States and weren't held in theater, which is what they preferred to do, you went out to the Greenville Conservation Camp, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is now the Greenbelt Department of Agriculture Center. And there you went to what they called a reconditioning battalion. And you did road marches, you did physical fitness, you practiced your standard soldier skills, you got back into shape, and you went back to the fight. There was a third group who were either going to return to duty in about 6 months after rehabilitation, perhaps an artificial limb, or you were going to end up getting discharged again in about 6 months. And those people came here. And so the goal was convalescence and rehabilitation, which meant minimal care. You woke up, they expect you to make your own bed in the morning. If you wanted to eat, you walked down the stairs to the dining facility. If you need to go to the dentist, you went up to the third floor. You walked up to the third floor. There was no elevators in the building. And that was to encourage you to exercise, to use your limbs, and to get back into, learning how to do them. They also taught a lot of skills here. So if you were a farmer who had lost an arm or lost a leg, you might not be able to go back to farming, but they could teach you business math, they could teach you stenography typing, and so that you would come out of here after that 6 months or so of rehabilitation with a usable skill. Okay. The initial renovations, the first president of the college had joined the Silver Spring Trolley Board and got them to run the trolley up Georgia Avenue as far as the school. Now, the girls weren't allowed to go on the trolley. That was beneath them. But what he was able to do was get to the end of run a power line from the trolley's power line over to the school. I'm sure they paid for the power, but it was DC, direct current power, which was not unusual at that time. And so they converted to AC power and put it on the commercial grid. So they were dealing with Washington Power and Light just like we do. Once they did that, they got to put in a lot more electricity. With 1,000 patients and an increase in staff as compared to the girls' school, where at peak year they had maybe 400 students here. They installed a whole bunch more toilets, bathrooms. You do that, you increase the water lines, you increase the sewer lines, paved roads, a lot of fire safety improvements. Those of you who've been here for a while remember the old brick stairwells that were just slapped on the front of the building. And then they renovated the kitchen. Some quick photos of the renovation. The most interesting thing is for the enlisted soldiers, if I can find it. Oop, I didn't want to do that. I'm looking for the, there we go. They had to install a serving line. The officers got served at the table like the girls did. The enlisted, they went through the line, cafeteria style, got a tray, went back. Here you can see the kitchen. This is now in the apartment area. Again, bakeries, things like that, because again, they're increasing the number of patients. They also did some new construction. They built a service company area. They had a segregated company of black soldiers. That's what they called them colored, parentheses colored at the time, who had their own barracks complex, their own mess hall, and they did, repair work, maintenance, things like that. And then they also built, and that area was over where the warehouse is today. And then they built a number of buildings to do the training in. And these buildings were built in '45, and some of you remember, this is the stables, and that's the gymnasium. So you see there are these 4 low buildings there. They're built out of cinder block. And then this F-shaped building back here. My house is right there. Those were built in the middle of 45, and they were built as Walter Reed prepared for the invasion of Japan, which was scheduled in November. Of course, the war ended in August when we dropped the atomic bombs, but they were expecting a significant number of casualties. To put it in perspective, when what is now the Defense Department ordered their Purple Hearts for the invasion, they did not order another Purple Heart until 1991. So everyone who received a Purple Heart in Korea, in Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Panama, they all got Purple Hearts that were made for the invasion of Japan. So you will see when Gene briefs that they were going full steam ahead until August 13th of 1945, and then things stop. And I believe with that, and a few pictures, and you can see, they're doing formations. This guy here, you can see, has 2 artificial legs. And what else I got? This is the PX snack bar, which is the second floor of the building that's right out here. There you can see them. Looks like I can't tell exactly where that is. I think that's in front of the gym, but I'm not sure. Inside the gymnasium, the fountain. For those of you who know about how the fountain leaks and has cracks in it, you can see that they're not new. And with that, I will turn it over to Gene.
Thank you very much, Don. So, now we're going to talk about what about the medical services at the Forest Glen Annex in 1945. So they've reconstructed it, they've ramped it up, and now it's a functioning healthcare facility. So first I'm going to talk about the general medical section, because I'm a general internist, and this is where the medical patients would have gone. And this all comes from an extensive report submitted in 1946 that described all of the clinical activities at Walter Reed General Hospital, including the Forest Glen Annex, the year of 1945. And while I'm going to come a little later to some experiences that Don helped me have at the archives in College Park, Don is really the one who did a fair amount of the copying of these long reports. So the report says that the general medical section at Walter Reed General Hospital had a subsection at the Forest Glen Annex, and it was on wards 59, 62, and 70. And one of the things that Don and I would like is a map of the facility that shows us where these wards are, because I do not know. The report says that they had detailed one medical corps officer as their physician. Now, in World War II, this could have been a general practice physician who had done an internship, or, and I would say probably more likely, it was somebody who had done a year of internal medicine residency, because you got paid more if you had done a residency in the military than if you were a general practice physician. This person was responsible for 111 patients here on the annex. Now, in 1977, I was a medical intern at the Minneapolis VA, and I might have 25 patients. And I was busy. I was busy with 25 patients. So if this one internist like me had 111 patients, that is a lot. So my guess is they were not very sick. And in fact, when you read the report, it doesn't look like they were very sick. In order to be transferred to this unit, you had to be ambulatory, so you weren't really bedridden, but you had to not live in the DC area. The implication was, go home. You could be transferred if it didn't interfere with observation and study. We'll come back to this, but this implies that if you were involved in a clinical research protocol, you stayed on the main campus. But if they needed acute care beds available at Walter Reed, that's when they would move folks. which it looked like they did quite a bit, at least at the beginning of the year. And you had to be able to participate in the reconditioning that they were doing here. As Don pointed out, you had to be able to walk to supper. You know, they weren't serving you food in your room, for example. Most of the patients await disposition, but others are receiving some prolonged treatment. We don't know exactly right now what treatments on the medical service they would have been getting here. I'm going to speculate. So here's one of the photos of soldiers who are in beds. This doesn't really look like any hospital that I'm familiar with, at least from the 1970s. And I certainly don't see any IVs. You know, I don't even see any clipboards for vital signs. So I don't honestly know that this is a general medical ward. Probably is not. And perhaps these people are healthier than this internist would have been rounding on. Now, what about surgery? Reviewing the surgical section report from 1945 from Walter Reed, there was no general surgery service and no inpatient specialty service here except orthopedic surgery. There were no operating theaters here. So, and for any clinicians or physicians in the audience? Okay, so I'm going to show my internal medicine bias. Surgeons, if a surgeon can't operate on the patient, they don't need the patient. The patient can be a medicine patient. So, you know, if you don't have an operating room handy, you know, it's not really a surgical patient. So, so there is no general surgery service at the annex, but they do report that they're doing orthopedic surgery rounds here. They don't describe why, but notice they had a very large amputation service at the main hospital with a peak census, and the report is a little vague, but it looks like it was March, 1,051 patients just on the orthopedic surgery amputation service in 1 month. Sorry about that, Steve. But you can see they had rapidly declining workload as well. By the end of the year, they only had 208 beds. And you can sort of understand why that might have been, because there was no longer active combat. Their main artificial limb shop was on the main campus, where the report says they did 1,158 fittings in artificial limbs in 1945. But there was an annex to the artificial limb shop here on this campus, where they actually did almost 4,000 adjustments. So the inference is they had a lot of patients here in 1945 who were recovering from amputations, and they had orthopedic surgeons rounding here to see how the stumps were doing, seeing if there were any surgical issues they needed to address, and also participate from an orthopedic surgery standpoint in the physical therapy. There were a variety of other healthcare services here in 1945. They had a pretty active ear, nose, and throat clinic where they say they did routine diagnostic and therapeutic procedures. Unfortunately, they don't list what they were, but I sort of know what they would have been doing, but they don't give us a count of what those visits were for. And a pretty active clinic, about 18 patients a day, which for one ENT doc would be, you know, including procedures, keep you fairly busy. But notice on the main campus, they had another 18,000, so a lot more action there. They had a laboratory. I'm going to come back to laboratory testing in 1945 in just a few minutes. But they had a laboratory here on the main campus, and they did over almost 8,000 lab tests. But they ran tests on over 100,000 specimens in 1945 at the main campus, a couple of 100,000 actual tests. So a very small lab compared to the major medical center 3 miles away. And they had an x-ray department. They say it was a bedside unit. They did almost 4,000 films. By the way, in the report, these are not called x-rays. They're not called a radiology department. It's called a röntgenology department. And you can see, though, at Walter Reed, they did over 52,000 x-rays that year. Now, so we know they had a portable unit, and Don assures me that the portable units that they used were the field units, which makes sense. You know, if you were an Army, you buy a whole bunch of field units, and, well, if you need a portable unit, just unbox one of those. You got plenty of them. So you can see here, this thing takes apart into 3 boxes, and then you stack up the boxes on the platform, and you have an x-ray unit. So we think that this was probably the portable x-ray unit that they had here that would allow you to do sort of standard films, chest x-rays, x-rays of limbs. They had a pharmacy, they had a dental clinic where 10,000 routine exams were done, but you can see the dental clinic on the main campus, much busier. And of course, a physiotherapy department and a reconditioning service, which there were a lot of programs. You heard about some of those that Don talked about. And there's a picture of the dental clinic. Don, did we ever figure out where that is? You could sort of see some other buildings behind it. But anyway, so there's your dental clinic. So thanks to Don helping us go out to the National Archives and getting a bunch of boxes pulled, I discovered this priceless treasure, professional standing orders for Walter Reed General Hospital in 1945. This lists orders, standard tests, test results. It's really a treasure trove. I went to medical school at Washington University in St. Louis, which is famous for something called the Washington University Manual, which is something that medical interns carry around. This is sort of the early version of that. It's kind of like, how do you treat pneumonia? And how do you do this kind of blood test? So, great stuff. So what diagnostic tests were being done at Walter Reed General Hospital in 1945? Now, not all of these were being done here, but we do know that blood counts and blood chemistries were being done here, so my guess is all of these tests were being done in the laboratory here. So they do things like they can do hemoglobins or red counts and the level of anemia or your red cell status, your white blood count. Something very popular in internal medicine, the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, which is a test for inflammation. Some blood chemistries, glucose, urea, nitrogen, and creatinine. Of course, glucose for diagnosing diabetes, urea, nitrogen, and creatinine for evaluating kidney function. But I was stunned to see no description of serum sodiums or serum potassiums, which in internal medicine, in sick patients, you just can't imagine treating the kinds of illnesses they were treating without those tests. But it turns out that we were not able to test for serum sodium or serum potassium in 1945. The first clinical disorders associated with these mineral deficiencies are described in 1948 and 1950. So they were managing diabetes, they were managing renal failure without even knowing what the minerals status was in people's blood. They were misdiagnosing calcium disorders as calcium disorders instead of potassium disorders because of complicated transport issues. Sometimes when your potassium gets low, your calcium gets messed up as well. So this was a fascinating time in the evolution of medicine in the West in the 1940s. So that allows me to transition for a minute to thinking about the evolving standards of evidence and the role of diagnostic tests and the position that they had achieved by 1945. So I think everybody here is aware that dating all the way back to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, physicians used this process of diagnosis to identify the putative causes of patient symptoms, to predict prognosis, which is what's going to happen next, and to identify what would be the appropriate treatment. Of course, diagnosis is a Greek term, so it goes all the way back to Greece. So this is a very old way of thinking about patients' symptoms and how to manage them. Now, the initial diagnoses were based on observation of symptoms, of palpation, feeling, and auscultation, listening. And then by the Middle Ages, we'd added smell and taste. We won't go into that anymore. And diagnosis was by pattern recognition. Who here has read Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow? Or have heard about fast thinking and slow thinking? So thinking fast is you look at it and you say it's one of these. And yes, you know, you're Sherlock Holmes if he looks at you and says, oh, well, you're a carpenter from Wales. And then you say, how did you know that? And he'll give you a long list of reasons. But in fact, what happens with an expert diagnostician is they're explaining after the fact, because what they did is way faster than listing those things in their head. They see it, and they say it's one of these. And that is that's classic diagnostic expertise. It's thinking fast, it's pattern recognition. It's like this. Well, there's the expert clinician holding the porcupine. Well, now we know what caused the abdominal pains. So now I've seen a case of porcupinitis. So now I know what porcupinitis is. This is a particular kind of abdominal pain. There are all the interns learning about porcupinitis. And so now you'll know the next time you see somebody who has too close a relationship with porcupines and has these symptoms, this is what it is. It's pattern recognition. Now, by the 19th century, we were moving into a different phase. We had lots of tests and a role for the laboratory in diagnosis now. The textbook of medicine in 1982 lists a number of tests that are being done at Walter Reed. And now we start not just doing diagnosis by pattern recognition, but by hypothetical deductive reasoning and even probabilistic reasoning. Osler, who wrote the textbook of medicine, said, errors in judgment must occur in the practice of an art which consists largely of balancing probabilities. This is no longer, it's one of these, I know it is. It's, could be this, could be that. What are the odds? A very different way of thinking about this. Slow thinking, not fast thinking. And why? Why is there a recognition that there are probabilities? Because tests like red counts and white counts are not positive or negative. They are a continuum. And some white counts are higher than other white counts. Some normal people have white counts that are not that different from the sick people. And in fact, there are even ways in which you sort of change the cutoff point and redefine the definition of who's sick and who isn't. So this sort of, the introduction of lab tests is making it more clear that statistics and probabilities are suddenly an element of diagnosis. Does that make sense? And in 1946, a new statistic, or a group of statistics, are added for understanding what these darn tests mean. Specificity, the probability of having a negative test given the disease is not present. And sensitivity, the probability of having a positive test given the disease is present. First publications of talking about tests in a quantitative sense of probability, 1946. Now, and as you think about it, and I know I enjoyed confusing my medical students with questions about sensitivity and specificity and what does this mean. It certainly seems like a good thing to know. It certainly seems like it's important to know the probability of a negative test given that the disease isn't present. But of course, if you're coming to me with a symptom, we don't know if you have the disease or not, right? So that probability is kind of relevant to your question, but it's not the answer to your question. What you want to know is what is the probability of the disease when the test is positive or when the test is negative. That is from Bayes' theorem. Who here knows Bayes' theorem? All right, got some folks who are Bayesians. This is a way of understanding how information builds on itself. And prior likelihood of something is an important predictor of what's going to happen next. but that isn't published in the medical literature until 1962. So we're here in Walter Reed in 1945, we are at the beginning of a transformation in how to think about diagnosis. All right, what about medical treatments at Walter Reed? So we had some pretty good ones, and probably the first three, my guess is, were being prescribed here. Insulin for diabetes, epinephrine and aminophylline for asthma, sulfadiazine for urinary tract infections, all stuff I used as an intern. On the main campus, probably, because I can't imagine that they were doing these things on these wards here. Intravenous plasma for shock, vitamin K for hepatitis-related bleeding disorders, penicillin for pneumococcal pneumonia, meningococcus, syphilis. Indeed, the main campus of Walter Reed had its own penicillin laboratory, and the physician scientists there developed a new method for refining penicillin, and got a visit from Alexander Fleming in 1945, sort of examining what they were doing to produce more penicillin. So some pretty cool treatments being used in 1945. But there were some things that weren't necessarily a good idea. There was ice to the stomach for upper gastrointestinal hemorrhage, which sounds odd to you, but let me tell you, that ain't nothing. When I was an intern, if you came in with upper GI bleeding, we would put a large tube down your throat, and we would wash out your stomach with ice water. And we were convinced that that would work because, of course, cold makes blood vessels contract, right? Only the reason your blood vessels contract is because they're in the surface of your skin. You don't have a countercurrent mechanism in your stomach, and I will come later to the kind of evidence that was required to get us to stop doing that to patients. But we were still doing it in the 1980s. Not just putting ice on the stomach, putting ice in the stomach. And then there's other stuff that is not just, doesn't work and probably not fun, but actually, if a medical intern or a medical student were to suggest one of these things, I would say, you have a great career in something else. Typhoid vaccine therapy for arthritis. Very weird. Caffeine, atropine, and strychnine for alcohol intoxication. Wake them up and stimulate them. And if they don't die from the seizures, digitalis and caffeine as stimulants for patients with renal insufficiency. Yeah, okay. The mind boggles that anybody would have even survived that. So this gets to the evolving standards of evidence and where we were in that evolution in 1945. So, of course, everybody realizes that in ancient medicine, it was really authoritative texts. You had Hippocrates, you had Galen, and they sort of told you this is how you diagnose things and this is how you treat them. And the process of study involved learning what Hippocrates and Galen said. And, of course, there were also theories of disease. And I think everybody's familiar with the four humors, which were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So, by the way, what are the four personalities? Phlegmatic. Yeah, phlegmatic, bilious, melancholic, and sanguine. And all kinds of treatments based on this. The one most famous that everybody knows about is bloodletting, which you had, of course, a theory related to you had too much sanguinity, so you had to remove some of it. One we don't like to talk about so much is purging. That was for your melancholic. So, your enemas and laxatives. Anyway, so that was the ancient basis. Now, with the Enlightenment, we had the British empiricists and an emphasis on observation. And, that observation was much more important than theory. So we start seeing case series in the 18th century. Citrus citrus fruits work for scurvy. In the 20th century, still only proven by case series, penicillin. Didn't have very much of it, so we couldn't do a trial, so we just gave it to people and saw if they got better. And lo and behold, a lot of them got dramatically better, so we concluded that it worked. But unfortunately, case series are not a very good standard of evidence. Don and I found, Don, was it 5 or more boxes? 14 boxes of files of patients in the 1930s through 1944 who were getting fever therapy for neurosyphilis, where they would bring them in and every couple of days would raise their temperature to 106 or 107 degrees for a couple of hours. And this was to treat their neurosyphilis. And then they dutifully recorded what happened and all the sessions that they did, and then they sent them a letter a year later and asked them if they were better or not. So this is, and this was a 10-year-long study. This is a classic case series study of this. Walter Reed. Then we moved a little further into comparative case series. So in the 19th century, for example, we got bloodletting in pneumonia. We got one group of patients who got it, one group of patients who didn't. Turned out the people who didn't get bloodletting did better. The 20th century, digitalis for pneumonia. Yeah, pneumonia, not heart failure, pneumonia. Digitalis for pneumonia, bad idea. So that's kind of like this. This is your 1930s operating theater, right? You got there, and now an example of the very same procedure done correctly. So, as you think about this, this is probably not the best way to generate evidence regarding whether that surgical approach is working. You probably think of a few problems with that study, like, lack of informed consent. But also there are other problems. So what is the kind of evidence that I haven't talked about yet that is so commonly used now as a standard of evidence? Anybody know? The randomized controlled trial. First randomized controlled trial in clinical medicine was published in 1948. It was a randomized controlled trial of streptomycin treatment of pulmonary tuberculosis done in the UK. And this, was really an important insight in terms of how to figure out whether an intervention was a good idea or a bad idea. How did we stop doing ice water lavage of unfortunate patients with gastrointestinal hemorrhage? Some skeptic finally did a randomized controlled trial. And lo and behold, didn't work. Lots of things that I thought worked when I was a medical student and resident and junior faculty member. Randomized controlled trial said they didn't work. So that's where we are in 1945. And as you saw from the stats on the orthopedic service, things are likely to be winding down. And indeed, in 1949, the general medical section at Forest Glen closes. So patients at Forest Glen, nobody who requires medical treatment is transferred here. The laboratory is closed, the x-ray department is closed, separate pharmacy is closed. But of course, just a couple of years later, things are going to change. So our next steps, we're going to locate and review these detailed reports from 43 to 75. We hope to summarize by year the clinical services provided and conditions treated at the Annex. We're going to identify Annex clinical research initiatives. For example, we know that in 1945, the orthopedic surgery department had started a research laboratory for artificial limbs. That was on the main campus. But we know that at some point it moves here. And that's a whole separate story for another time. And we'll try to provide further illustrations on future Veterans Days of how diagnosis, medical technology, and treatment has evolved at Forest Glen. So now Andrea is going to tell us a little bit about the facilities that we've got at the museum just across the street and down the road. Andrea.
So my name is Andrea, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Jean and Don, for inviting me to come. They came to visit us at the museum, so I thought it was wonderful that they were interested in us coming out just for a few minutes, just to say hello and tell you a little bit about us. We love to have researchers come in the museum, and Don has been a longtime friend of the museum. He knows about our archives, and he knows where things are, and he's followed us over here to the new facility. Many of you will remember that the museum has had many homes, and some of you may even have visited us when we were on the National Mall. Anybody here visit us then? Absolutely. So we had a beautiful facility that eventually was moved up to Walter Reed when the Hirshhorn Museum got the property down on the National Mall. And we were at Walter Reed for many years, from the 1960s, 70s, all the way up until we moved in 2011, 10 or so. So it took us a little bit to move out. So we had a really spacious place at Walter Reed, and we had a very spread out museum. We talked about the human body, we talked about Civil War medicine and all of our collections, and then we moved to this wonderful space across the street. And so we are happy to be your neighbors, but the museum is a little different. And let me tell you a little bit about how we started. 1862, the Union Surgeon General decided that we needed a better way to figure out what was happening with our Civil War soldiers, how to better treat them, how to prevent disease and understand what was going on with those soldiers. So we started a collection, and that became the Army Medical Museum, and eventually was renamed the National Museum of Health and Medicine. Our collection started out, I'll say, the big three. We have archives, which some of the photographs I believe that you've seen tonight probably came from our archival collection. All of you are welcome. If you make an appointment, if you have a topic you'd like to look into, you certainly may come to the museum and take a look in our archives. We also have a historical collection, which is material culture. That's where you're going to find the microscopes. You're going to find the suture needles. You'll find absolutely beautiful things like iron lungs that we don't see anymore. Really interesting technologies that were used to treat people, especially with the focus on military medicine. We also have anatomical collections. So we have wet materials as well as dry bone materials, and our purpose is to really showcase an understanding of American military medicine and medicine in general. So we also collect brain materials, we collect human developmental materials, and these are research collections. And so many times we'll have folks come to us ready with their microscopes to collect data for new studies on whether it be traumatic brain injury, cleft palate studies, all sorts of things go on at the Medical Museum. So when you come in our doors, and you are always welcome, 7 days a week we are open, except for December 25th. We have tours on most every day, or if you'd like to arrange a special tour, let's say you have a group here at the seminary, maybe you have a bridge club or you have a book club and you'd like to come over and see the museum, you may do that. So you can let us know when you'd like to. Sometimes you'll see tents outside, and that's one of the things that I do at the museum. So I lead the public programs department. So when you see things come across your email from a listserv, maybe Bonnie sends something out, she'll be telling us about things like our teddy bear clinic. So if you have children, grandchildren, or you know there are children in the neighborhood, that is a great way for them to get familiar with physicians and what to expect when they go for checkups. We have Scout Day. We do art projects that have to do with the brain or with human anatomy. We get involved in outreach programs, so you'll see us other places. We also, this summer, especially in August, we always do our Anatomy of Sports program. And you can see here, there is one of our campus members is painting on the leg of an athlete to show how our muscles and bones work together. So that's anatomical illustration. So we do lots of fun things at the museum. We want you to feel that you're welcome to come over anytime that you'd like to see us. If you have questions, you want to know how something works or what we have. When Walter Reed closed, some of their collections actually came to us. And so those are some things that people are exploring and learning more about. So is there any question that you have for me tonight? Anything you'd like to know about the museum? What's our most famous exhibit? Well, okay, when people come to our museum, I'm going to say the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, where's the bullet that killed Lincoln? That's what they want to know. And so we can point you in that direction. Military medicine played a role in the last hours of Lincoln's life. And the museum staff members actually did Lincoln's autopsy. And they retrieved the bullet and the evidence that was entered and used at the trial against John Wilkes Booth and the conspirators. So those materials are on display right now. Some people come in and they ask, where is Dan Sickles' leg? They want to know where the leg bones are from that famous general who he was shot at, or he was hit by a cannonball at the peach orchard at Gettysburg. And he's famous for having, he stayed pretty much astute during the time of the battle, and he actually asked his surgeon when his leg was amputated to put it in a little box. They say it was lined with velvet. He put his calling card on top. It said, "Compliments of General D.E.S., Dan E. Sickles," and sent it to the medical museum. So we cleaned it up. I'd hate to have received the mail that day because he was quite famous in his own mind, I will say. And Dan Sickles came to us once he was healed. He never wore a prosthetic. He always had his crutch, and he was happy and proud to show off his war wound. And when he came to see the leg, he got really upset with us because we threw his foot away. There was nothing wrong with it. So this was a museum about trauma and pathology. We didn't need a normal foot. So he finally forgave us, and eventually the news would capture him coming on the anniversary of his losing of his limb. He would always come to see it and bring his friends and family. And so some of you, if you're old Washingtonians, you'll remember Dan Sickles was the one who his wife was having a love affair with Francis Scott Key's son. And he caught him on his way to visit with his wife one day, pulls out his gun, shot him point blank in Lafayette Square right in front of the White House. And he ends up going off to prison. He ends up pleading insanity. He said he was driven to do it. It's what happens. And so he was the first case of temporary insanity. He was let off of that. So he was an interesting character. Come see Dan Sickles' leg. Then they want to see the leg, Don. They have to see the leg. So we do have the tremendous elephantiasis leg. We have some fabulous things in the museum. I would encourage you to come see us. We have an exhibit now that's on the brain and brain injury and rehabilitation. We focus on Civil War medicine, and we also focus on history of military medicine. At our table, there's a little sheet where you can sign up for our e-newsletter if you'd like to know what goes on. We also do an evening lecture series once a month, so come to see us at the museum. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.